Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The dagger's tip dug into the soft flesh beneath his jaw just enough to draw a single, hot bead of blood, but the man holding the blade didn't flinch, and neither did the man with the steel against his throat. "Do it, Julian," the Grand Duke whispered, his voice a low rumble of dark amusement that vibrated against the younger man's chest. "Sever the artery. Watch the life drain from the monster of the north. It is what you have prayed for every night for 3 years, isn't it?" Julian Vane, once the crown prince of a kingdom now reduced to ash and history books, trembled, not from fear, but from the terrifying, electric realization that his hand refused to obey his mind. He stood in the dim, flickering light of the command tent, the heavy canvas battered by the howling winter wind outside, holding the life of his greatest enemy in his hands. General Valerius Thorn, the man who had burned his city, shackled his wrists in cold iron, and then, with a cruelty worse than death, made Julian his personal strategist, sat comfortably in his high-backed leather chair, his neck exposed, his obsidian eyes gleaming with a predatory challenge. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. The relationship between Valerius Thorn and Julian Vane was a festering wound that refused to heal, a complex tapestry of hatred and obsession woven over 3 long years of war. Valerius, known to the Empire as the Black Dragon, was a man of absolute brutal efficiency. He did not conquer for glory. He conquered because it was the only language the world understood. Julian, conversely, was the silver swan of the fallen kingdom of Ethelgard, a scholar, a tactician, a man of logic and grace whose spirit should have broken when his crown fell. But it hadn't, and that was why Valerius kept him. Technically, Julian was a slave, a spoil of war. But Valerius had placed a collar of enchanted silver around his neck, not to bind his magic, for Julian had none, but to bind his life. The Siren's Knot it was called. If Valerius died, the collar would snap Julian's neck instantly. It was the only explanation the Empire accepted for why the Grand Duke allowed a brilliant enemy tactician to live in his tent, eat at his table, and plan his battles. It was a failsafe. Or at least, that was the lie Valerius told his generals. The truth was far more dangerous. The truth was that Valerius had keyed the collar to a specific verbal command, a release phrase only he knew. He could free Julian at any moment. He kept the prince bound not out of necessity, but out of a dark, insatiable hunger to see if the swan would ever stop trying to bite the hand that fed it. The dagger lowered. Julian took a ragged breath, stepping back, the weapon clattering onto the map-strewn table. "You are unbearable," Julian hissed, his pale blue eyes flashing with frustration. He ran a hand through his silver hair, which had grown long and unruly in the months on the campaign trail. "If I kill you, I die. You know I value my survival over your satisfaction." Valerius touched the small cut on his neck, smearing the drop of blood with his thumb. He looked at the red stain, then up at Julian, his expression unreadable. "Is that the only reason, little prince?" "Survival. The logistical reports for the southern supply line are unfinished," Julian deflected, turning his back on the massive man. He busied himself with a stack of parchment, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "And if you intend to take the Iron Citadel by week's end, you need me to find the weakness in their wall. I cannot do that if you are goading me into murder." Valerius stood up. The sound of his heavy boots crunching on the floorboards made Julian's shoulders tense. The general was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and scarred, radiating a heat that seemed to suck the air out of the freezing tent. He moved behind Julian, not touching him, but close enough that Julian could feel the warmth radiating from his armor. "The weakness in the wall is the aqueduct," Valerius murmured, his voice right beside Julian's ear. "You found it 3 days ago? You're stalling." Julian stiffened. "I am verifying." "You are hesitating." Valerius's hand came up, hovering over Julian's shoulder before gripping it firmly. It wasn't a caress, but it wasn't an attack either. It was an anchor. "You know that once the citadel falls, the campaign is over. We return to the capital, to the emperor's court." Julian went still. The capital. The snake pit where Julian would be paraded as a trophy, and Valerius would be married off to some highborn duchess to secure a political alliance. The thought sent a spike of nausea through Julian's gut that had nothing to do with his hatred for the Empire. What does it matter to me where my cage is located? Julian replied coldly, pulling away from the touch. Gold bars or iron bars, I am still your property. Are you? Valerius asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Before Julian could construct a biting retort, the tent flap was thrown open. A soldier, breathless and covered in snow, stumbled in, saluting frantically. Lord Commander. An ambush. The scout patrol, they've been slaughtered. The rebels. They're here. In the canyon. Valerius's demeanor shifted instantly. The teasing predator vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating warlord. He grabbed his greatsword from the rack. How many? Hundreds, sir. They fly the banner of Ethelgard. Julian froze. His people. The remnants of his royal guard. They had come for him. Valerius paused, looking back at Julian. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. This was the moment. If Julian's people were here, this was his chance to escape, to betray Valerius, to reclaim his birthright. Stay here, Valerius commanded, his voice devoid of the earlier warmth. Guard him, he barked to the soldier. No, Julian said, grabbing his cloak. I'm coming. Valerius turned, his eyes narrowing. To join them. To ensure you don't walk into a trap. Julian lied, though he wasn't sure if it was a lie. You are a brute with a sword, Valerius, but you are blind to the terrain. That canyon is a bottleneck. If you ride in, you die? And if you die? He tapped the silver collar at his throat. I die. Valerius studied him for a second that felt like an eternity. Then, a sharp, grim smile touched his lips. Ride with me, then. But if you turn your coat, Julian, I will kill you myself before the collar does. The canyon was a white hell. The blizzard had descended with renewed fury, turning the world into a swirling vortex of ice and shadow. The ambush had been brutal. The Ethelgard rebels, desperate and starving, had triggered a rock slide that separated Valerius's vanguard from the main army. Now it was just chaos. Steel clashing against steel, the screams of horses, the spray of hot blood on white snow. Julian rode close to Valerius, his mind racing. He shouted coordinates, pointing out flank movements, guiding Valerius's strikes with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra of death. He watched as Valerius fought, a whirlwind of violence, his greatsword cleaving through enemies with terrifying ease. But there were too many of them. My prince, a voice screamed over the wind. Julian turned his horse. A man in tattered blue armor, the royal crest of Ethelgard barely visible, was rushing toward him, sword drawn not at Julian, but at the imperial soldier guarding his flank. It was Sir Cedric, Julian's former childhood instructor. Cedric, Julian gasped. Come to us, Cedric roared, cutting down the guard. We are here for you. Run, my prince. The trap is set for the dragon. Time seemed to slow. Julian looked at Cedric, offering him freedom, offering him a return to the past. Then he looked at Valerius. The general was surrounded by 6 men. He was fighting like a demon, but he was exposed. An archer on the ridge above had drawn a bead on Valerius's unprotected neck, just above the gorget. Valerius didn't see the archer. He was too busy keeping the 6 men away from Julian's position. Why is he protecting me? The thought crashed into Julian's mind. Valerius could have broken through the line and escaped, but he was holding his ground to keep the rebels from reaching Julian. The archer loosed the arrow. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was instinct born of 3 years of shadowing this man, of learning the rhythm of his breathing, the beat of his heart. Julian kicked his horse, throwing himself not toward Cedric, but toward Valerius. Down! Julian shrieked. He collided with Valerius, knocking the massive general from his saddle, just as the black-fletched arrow whistled through the space where Valerius's throat had been. It slammed into Julian's shoulder instead. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in Julian's body. He hit the snow hard, the world spinning into darkness. The last thing he heard was a roar, a sound so primal, so full of rage and terror, that it shook the very mountains. It was Valerius screaming his name. Waking up was a slow, agonizing process. The first thing Julian registered was heat. Not the biting cold of the snow, but a suffocating, intense warmth. Then came the smell, pine smoke, wet fur, and the metallic tang of blood. He groaned, trying to move, but a heavy weight pinned him down. Do not move. The command was ragged, harsh. Julian fluttered his eyes open. He was in a small cave, sheltered from the blizzard. A fire crackled nearby, and Valerius Thorn was hovering over him, his face pale, his armor stripped off to reveal a white shirt stained with crimson. You, Julian rasped, his throat dry. You're alive. Because of you. Valerius spat the words like a curse. He was pressing a cloth to Julian's shoulder, his hands that could crush a skull, trembling visibly. You idiot. You absolute, suicidal fool. Julian hissed as Valerius tightened the bandage. I saved my investment. Shut up, Valerius growled. The arrow was poisoned. Wolfsbane and rot root. A concoction of your own people's making. Julian laughed weakly. Irony. I cut it out, Valerius said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. I had to carve the flesh out, Julian. You almost died. The collar. I thought the collar would trigger because your heart stopped for a moment. Julian looked up at the general. The arrogant, untouchable black dragon looked undone. His hair was matted with sweat, his eyes wide and haunted. Why are you angry? Julian whispered. You have thousands of soldiers. You could have left me. Cedric. He would have taken me. Yes, Valerius said, his jaw tightening. He would have. Then why? Julian pushed, the fever making him bold. Why drag a dying slave into a cave? Why not let me go back to my people? Or let me die and be free of this burden? Valerius stared at him, his dark eyes searching Julian's face. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howling wind outside. Because, Valerius said, his voice breaking, I did not burn Ethelgard for the Empire. Julian blinked. What? I burned it to get to you. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I saw you, Valerius continued, the words tumbling out now, unstoppable. Years ago, at the Peace Summit, you were standing in the gardens, debating philosophy with the scholars. You were so brilliant. So alive. I knew then, if I left you there, you would be married off to some southern king, buried in politics, wasted. I wanted you. I wanted your mind. I wanted your fire. I became the monster so I could be the one to hold the cage key. Because if I hold the key, no one else can touch you. Julian stared at him, horror and awe warring in his chest. You started a war. For me. I am a selfish man, Julian. Valerius whispered, leaning down, his forehead resting against Julian's uninjured shoulder. I am a tyrant. A villain. I know this. And I knew you would hate me. I needed you to hate me. Because if you hated me, you would watch me. You would focus on me. You wouldn't look at anyone else. You are insane, Julian breathed. But his hand, of its own volition, lifted to touch Valerius's hair. Yes, Valerius agreed. He lifted his head, his face inches from Julian's. And today, when you took that arrow, when you chose me over your freedom, you broke me, Julian. You win. I cannot do this anymore. Valerius reached for his belt. He pulled out a small, intricate key. With shaking hands, he brought it to Julian's throat. Valerius, I release you, Valerius said, his voice hoarse. He unlocked the silver collar. It fell away with a soft clink onto the stone floor. Go. When the storm clears, go find Cedric. Tell him the dragon is dead. Julian touched his neck. The skin felt naked, strange. He was free. He could leave. He could let Valerius freeze in this cave or wait for the rebels to find him. He looked at the collar on the floor. Then he looked at Valerius, who had turned away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, waiting for the end. This man was a monster. He was a warlord. He was the architect of Julian's ruin. But he was also the only man who had ever seen Julian, truly seen him, not as a prince or a symbol, but as a soul. You are a terrible strategist, Julian said softly. Valerius stiffened but didn't turn. Go, Julian. If I leave, Julian said, shifting painfully to sit up. Who will correct your maps? Who will stop you from drinking poison wine? Who will keep you warm in this freezing hell? Valerius turned slowly, his eyes wide with disbelief. You are free. Why would you stay? Because, Julian whispered, dragging himself closer until their knees touched. I think I am insane too. He reached out, grabbing the lapels of Valerius's bloodied shirt, and pulled him down. Valerius didn't resist. He crashed into Julian like a tidal wave. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision of 3 years of repressed rage, grief, and undeniable, scorching desire. It tasted of blood and ash and desperation. Valerius's hands tangled in Julian's hair, holding him as if he were the only solid thing in a disintegrating world. Julian's good arm wrapped around Valerius's neck, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss until they were both gasping for air, drinking each other in. It was a surrender, not of a kingdom, but of the walls they had built around their hearts. Valerius pulled back, just an inch, his lips swollen, his eyes dark with a hunger that terrified and thrilled Julian. "You stayed," Valerius whispered, his voice full of wonder. "I stayed," Julian replied, breathless, tracing the scar on Valerius's cheek. "Now, shut up and keep me warm, General." "That is an order." Valerius let out a low, rough laugh, a sound of pure relief, and captured Julian's lips again, burying the prince in his arms, shielding him from the cold, from the world, and from the past. And that is how the viper tamed the wolf. If you enjoyed seeing the mighty General Valerius brought to his knees by love, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive a husband who started a war just to possess you? Or is that a red flag too big to ignore? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then, prompt image. Prompt. Masterpiece, best quality, high-res. 1.2. Korean manhwa style, semi-realistic, digital art. 2 men. BL. Yaoi. Man 1. General Valerius, muscular build, dark hair, sharp jawline, facial scars, wearing unbuttoned military uniform with fur cloak, intense expression of longing and relief, holding Man 2. Man 2. Prince Julian, slender but toned, long silver hair, pale skin, bandaged shoulder, wearing tattered noble clothes, looking up with a mix of defiance and affection, romantic and dramatic atmosphere. Inside a dimly lit cave, warm firelight contrasting with blue snowstorm outside the entrance, discarded silver collar on the rocky floor, intense eye contact, cinematic lighting, sharp focus, intricate details.